Welcome back to the book club. Today's video is going to be a part two to my book discussion on Memories of Ice. This is book three of Malazan Book of the Fallen, or Malazan Book of the Fallen. This is going to be a spoiler filled book discussion just about my thoughts on the book. So if you haven't read the book, it's not going to make that much sense. And also, I'm going to be spoiling a lot of things, so be careful. The reason I'm making a part two here is a couple commenters, shout out to you guys, commented on some things that I didn't get a chance to talk about, and it kind of inspired me to write down more of my thoughts about the book, especially the areas that I didn't cover in the first part, and talk about those as well. Because the first part, although it was like 40 minutes, it was mostly focused on how the prologue related to the rest of the book. And there's just a lot of other things that happen too that are interesting that I didn't get the chance to talk about. So I've got a bunch of categories here that I'm just going to scroll through and start talking about, and hopefully, I don't get too sidetracked along the way. So, the first thing that I wanted to talk about was kind of focusing on Whiskey Jack. I think that in this book, especially, he had a really interesting arc. So, there's this sort of friendship bond between Whiskey Jack and Animander Rake that got formed throughout this book. They're sort of two unlikely allies because in Gardens of the Moon, they're sort of on opposite ends of the spectrum and they're kind of battling each other, or they are straight up battling each other in Pale. But then, in this book, they kind of had to become allies to, fight against the Panny and Seer and all of that stuff. So we sort of see over the course of the book, they find out that they're actually pretty similar and they're not as different as maybe they once thought they were. And they create this friendship. Whiskey Jack also forms a bond with Corlat over the course of this book, and they have their own little relationship as well, which I think is actually related to, how Whiskey Jack ends up becoming friends with Animander. I think Corlat being number two to Animander, she saw a lot in his leadership. She saw a lot in Whiskey Jack that she saw in like Animander's leadership. She saw that Whiskey Jack got the respect of his peers and like people followed him, and that was like he was just a very respectable, honest guy. Honest in most situations. There was kind of some like drama between shared secrets that they kind of couldn't talk about throughout the book, but like he was just a very commendable guy and like an honest soldier sort of person. So one of the scenes in particular I want to talk about with Animander and Whiskey Jack was the execution of the women of the Dead Seed. I'm also not sure if I talked about this in part one. I can't remember at this point, but the whole like children and women of the Dead Seed is absolutely insane. It's probably one of the weirdest like cult like groups of people I've seen in any fantasy book that I've read so far. And I did see a note on the wiki too that Erickson actually talked to somebody about whether or not it's actually possible, and they did confirm that it is possible for this to happen. Um, which, like, even if it wasn't possible, I mean, it's a fantasy book, so it could be possible in this world, but it's very fucked up. And just like completely bizarre. But anyways, there's this scene where Animander, goes dragon mode and is taking down the women of the Dead Sea and the Ten of Scoury, and they sort of have this like chaotic power that's protecting them. So eventually, Animander detransitions from dragon back to human, and then goes in with Dragnipur and starts like slashing them down and trapping them in the sword. And Whiskey Jack basically stops him, and they sort of Whiskey Jack finishes the job. So they talk about the weight of taking lives, and Whiskey Jack understands the weight of what Rake is doing because he knows that people that get hit with Dragnipur sort of get stuck and trapped in the sword forever. And I think that part of it is that these women of the Dead Seed are sort of brainwashed. They're like a brainwashed cult, and they're not necessarily evil and deserving of that sort of punishment. They're just like, I don't know, they've been manipulated by the Panty and Seer, maybe magically, maybe not, but this is maybe an unjust punishment for them. And so Whiskey Jack thought that Dragnipur was too harsh of a punishment. Um, and there's a quote that I wrote down from an exchange between Animander and Whiskey Jack that I think like really drills home the moment. But Animander says, "To one side, my friend, what I do is a mercy." And in that moment, Whiskey Jack interprets this as Animander saying that what he does is a mercy to the women of the Dead Seed that he's killing. But he sort of later reflects on this and thinks that, like later in the chapter, he thinks that perhaps it was actually a mercy to himself. So Something that he thinks to himself later is, Lord of Moonspawn, you asked me to step aside. You called it a mercy. I misunderstood you. A mercy not to the women of the dead seed, but to me. Thus your sorrowed smile when I denied you. Ah, my friend, I saw only your brutality, and that hurt you. Better for both of us, you had crossed blades with me, for both of us. So this is sort of maybe more of my like Whiskey Jack being a little suicidal tendency. Like this is sort of where I got that theory from. And then he continues and says, "And I am not worth such friends. Old man, foolish gestures plague you. Be done with it. Make this your last war. Make it your last." Even more suicidal tendencies from Whiskey Jack. But basically, in this moment, he realizes that like Animander was basically accepting. He's kind of doing an Itkovian, which who is someone I'm going to talk about later. But Animander does a bit of an Itkovian move here, where he takes the burden of having to kill these women who maybe don't deserve it, but need to still die because there's this chaotic magic they're using. And he takes that burden from Whiskey Jack so that he doesn't have to bear it. But then Whiskey Jack decides to take it anyways. He has to like live with the grief of having killed these women, and also like the fact that all of his soldiers watched him do it as well, which is something that weighs on him. So I think this was like a very powerful sort of turning point in his arc in the center of the book. Like it sort of solidified his friendship with Animander, having this realization that Animander's not actually this brutal guy, but he's kind of merciful in a way, and he's not necessarily using his sword to capture souls. We actually learn later that Dragnipur has this like need for more and more and more souls, and it's not necessarily like the wagon that's being pulled is going to get sucked up into this chaotic portal that's chasing it. Um, so perhaps Animander's not actually using the sword as much as he should be, because he's being more cautious with it and is actually not just this like brutal guy who's killing everybody, but actually has a has a conscience and that kind of thing. So I'll probably touch more on some things with Whiskey Jack later, but that's sort of what I had for this topic. Next up, I want to talk a little bit more about the Panion Domin. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's how I've been saying it in my head. What's interesting about this to me is that throughout this book, and even in Gardens of the Moon, where the Panion Domin's mentioned a little bit, we don't actually see much about the structure of the Panion Domin. We know that the Panion Seer is this like evil guy. We know that they have a bunch of cities that are like empty and are have been ravaged by the tennis scoury and blah blah blah. But we kind of just see like the bad sides of this like crazy like warlord. But it's really interesting that there's such a um I don't know about complicated, but there's like a deep military structure that they have as well, which doesn't really jive with the fact that they're like a bunch of crazy people. So it kind of like adds this weird background, like maybe there's actually more to the Panion Domain than is being told to us, because they have such a deep structure. So I want to go through. I have a link to the wiki open with like what their various military structure looks like, but to me, it sort of shows that there's this logic to the Panion Domain that um, is maybe unexpected from someone who's just led by this crazed Jagged who is seeking revenge, because they have so many different like factions. So there's the Panion Seer, who's kind of the head of uh, the Domin. There's the Septarch, who's the ruler of one of the 7 districts of the Domin. There's the Seer Domin that we see a lot. They're the bodyguards and the assassin sect of the Domin. Then there's Urdo, who's like the Urdo and the Urdo men, who are the heavy elite infantry. There's Beta Klites, medium infantry. There's Beklites, regular infantry. There's Betrulid, light cavalry. There's Beta Coolid, medium cavalry. There's Scalandi, which are skirmishers. The Desandi, which are sappers. And then the Teniscauri, which are the peasant army who are, eating everybody. But all of these different things are mentioned throughout the book and like described in some way. And having this much, like this is more structure than the Malazan army is, has. We know that the Malazan army has like sappers and that kind of thing, but they don't have like 10 different names for different sects of the army. So it is really interesting that like we only see the Panion Seer as this crazy guy who's like torturing talk and is insane. But clearly somebody had to create this military structure, so like maybe there's a little bit more to it than we really get to see in the book. They had to have conquered from somewhere, so there's some logic going on within this like crazy empire. Um, so I guess that's all I have about that. But I did think that that was a little interesting. It was just a weird thing for me where I'm curious why there was so much thought put into the Panian military, despite not really seeing a reason for it. Next up, I want to talk more about Capistan, the first siege that we see within this book. About halfway through, a little bit more than halfway through. So one of the things that we learn in Capistan is that there's these. I don't know if it's talked about earlier in the series. I don't really remember it. Maybe it's just offhand, but we learn about these like triumvirates of Fenner's Reeve, and presumably there's other um, triumvirates that for different gods that sort of fit this mold. But we learn about how a shield anvil is um, is a mortal soul to assume the sorrow of the world on behalf of a god. So this is like the role that Itkovian plays, and later the shield anvil gets passed to somebody else. But Itkovian's kind of the notable shield and there's the Destriant, who are harvesters of souls possessing power to slay in a god's name, to slay, to heal, to deliver justice. That's a quote from Hiboric in I think the last book that I found on the wiki. And we see the Fenner Destrian, I forget his name, but he plays a role in this book as well. And then there's also the Mortal Sword, which is a role that we see a few different people play. And this is the god's mortal defender, manifestation of the god's own sword. So we see Fenner's mortal sword in one scene, who, again, I forget his name at this point, but he gets sort of like, he knows that he's walking into a trap and eventually gets killed. But we also see that Gruntle becomes the mortal sword of Trake throughout this book. So I thought that like these triumvirates of like people who worship some of the gods are very interesting. I'm not sure if this kind of thing is going to come up more um, in the future, but it was like an important part of this book at least because a lot of what was happening in Capistan was related to Fenner and to Trake and these different like religious factions, if you could call it that. Um, so I mentioned it before, but Itkovian is the main one of the main people that we learn about, who's the Shield Anvil, and Grumble as the or Gruntle. I wrote Grumble down by accident. Gruntle as the mortal sword of Trake, or Treach, or whatever various characters call it. Those were the two standouts. So um, now I want to talk a little bit more about Gruntle's arc. We sort of follow him as a caravan guy who like doesn't really for the longest time throughout the book I was like I'm very curious where like why we're reading about Gruntle because like he's sort of we learn that he's a caravan guy, um goes into the city, he becomes an alcoholic, but Gruntle's anger and then subsequent ascension follows his friend Stani, I believe is how you're supposed to say it. I was saying Stony for a while, but I think it's supposed to be Stani. So Stani got raped by a Seer Doman during the battle at the very beginning of the siege. And Gruntle sort of he learns about this and immediately like something flips in his mind. And he from that moment on, or maybe a little bit beforehand, gradually turns into the mortal sword of Drake. I'm not sure if there's really like a moment where you can say he became it. But like over the course of basically after that event, he keeps seeing like little scenes where it's like, oh, there's this like weird, there's this army that's somehow surviving and killing everybody that's still out in the city. And we sort of know as the reader that that's Gruntle, but from like, I think it's like from Kovian's point of view and stuff. They're not exactly sure who's doing this. Um, we also later see that um, there's a scene later in the battle with Wrath Fenner, the priest of Fenner, who's like the false Destriant. Um, he there's a gathering with with all of these people that are in the city. This is after the bridge burners enter the city, and Paran is there as well. But we see Wrath Fenner losing his hands and sort of um, Fenner himself coming down into the mortal world, which correlates with the scene in Deadhouse Gates with Hiboric in front of that like jade statue thing, where we learn that Fenner has like descended into the mortal realm and is now no longer a god and is being replaced by Trake. I guess it's still unclear to me exactly how that works. Um, I think Fenner is like a boar So is there just like a giant boar running around now and he's going to die eventually? I'm not sure, but it's kind of clear that Trake is replacing Fenner, and the priesthoods that are following it are flipping and that kind of thing. Um, and then there's also in this same scene at Kovian as the Shield Anvil took the grief of the fellow Fenner troops, and but after the swap of Fenner and Trake is what I call that, at least, he cleansed Capistan, but he no longer had a god to support his role as this like taker of the grief, and it started weighing on him, and this sort of sets him up for what happens later after the Siege of Coral. So at the end of the Battle of the Siege of Coral, or maybe it was during, I'm not exactly I can't exactly remember when it happens, but it's towards the end of the battle at the very least. There's this like field of Talana Moss in front of him that are basically just like hoping to get released from their I don't want to say imprisonment, but more just like their stasis, I guess. Like we sort of learned that the Talani Moss in the first gathering sort of entered this state of stasis where they would just live forever so that they could finish their mission of eliminating all the Jaggets from the world, I guess. Um, and the goal of the second gathering with Silver Fox, or I think the hope of that second gathering, was that they'd be released from this and would be allowed to die. Except Silver Fox kind of didn't do that. And I think her plan, my interpretation at least, is that her plan was, one last job. Like I'm supposed to release them now, but I want to use them against like in the Siege of Coral so that um the Kachane Chamal and whatever else is there can be taken down by the Talani Moss, and then I'll let them go. Um and I think that the Talani Moss did not like that very much. But Itkovian sort of stepped in and he took the grief and the pain from these Talani Moss so that they could pass into the afterlife. And that that killed Itkovian ultimately. And then there's like this scene of him being buried under a pile of treasure. Like the Talani Moss kept walking by and giving him stuff, which I think was a um, a very nice gesture. It was interesting that he just like got a gravesite of all the stuff that people put on top of him because he like sacrificed himself for them. Um, and so I think that there's this like that it was a very tragic scene. The last I think this all happened within the last chapter. Maybe it was the last two chapters, but the last chapter was like 100 pages, and I don't know, 75% of it was just really sad because it was like the death of Whiskey Jack, Edkovian sacrificing himself, the bridge burners that are inside the castle are in trouble and like dying left and right. There's just death all over the place. There's like Paran and Quickben coming back from helping out, you know, un unmadden the Panian Seer, sort of separate him from the influence of the crippled god and release him back into this final like Omtos Falak Warren um, down with the followers of Burn or wherever that scene took place. So all these like sad things happen all at once, and this is just one of there's just a pile of sad things piling up, and that's sort of symbolized by this pile of treasures left on top of Itkovian's grave. Um, a little bit backing up a little bit with the Siege of Coral. Something that I don't think I talked about really much at all in my first video was Lady Envy. So she, as the daughter of Draconis, was sort of coming up from the south along with Tok the Younger and the dogs and those three Segula who were like charmed by her. I assume magically charmed by her, but I'm not sure if that is 100% proven or not. But we learn that she like Cruel talks to her at some point, and we learn that she's coming up north, or sorry, yeah, coming up from the south, attacking the Panian Domain, hoping to distract from the assault from the north. So like she's basically, because she's super powerful, she can alone do what an army can do, and is just like being the distraction from the south to give the armies of Malazans and like Kaladin Brood and stuff a better shot at taking down the Panion Seer ultimately. And Talk the Younger is with her for a while, and eventually decides that she's kind of crazy and he's probably going to die if he sticks with her. So he decides to join the Tenascowry, um, like pretend to join them basically, and link up with the Malazans eventually. But his plan is kind of foiled because he gets captured and ultimately tortured by the Pannian Seer and one of these matrons of the Kachan Chain Jamal. Um, still can't say that word and don't know how to say it. But we learn that like Tog, the Wolf of Winter, who's seeking Fandaray, his mate, which is like one of the other dogs, or is inhabiting one of the other dogs that was with, or the A, the AY thing that was with Lady Envy. They were sort of seeking each other. So um, when Talk got separated from them, eventually they did meet back up again. But at that point, Talk's body was completely destroyed. Um, and also, Anaster, who was the child of the Dead Seed, had all of his grief taken away by a shield anvil. The one, I believe it was the shield anvil that replaced Itkovian. I forget what her name is. Maybe it was like Norrel or something like that. But Anaster basically became this empty shell who also was missing an eye. And Talk, or I guess it was through Tog. Tog got like released, and as sort of payback for Talk, carrying him around, um, was reborn into an Aster's body. So now, what used to be an Aster is actually Talk the Younger, and Talk the Younger is still around and is like given a new body. So I think it's the least he could do with all the torture that Talk had to go through, where he's just like being crunched up by by the matron, um, for like the entire book, basically. But unfortunately, Talk is still missing an eye, so I guess that's sort of his signature move. But so that's one of the factions from this Battle of Coral. I think also in general, the Battle of Coral was this very cinematic moment. Um, I think that if there were to be a movie about um, one of the books of the Malazan series that I've read so far, at least, this is definitely like the moment that's the most movie like, where there's all these different factions coming together for like this one epic battle. There's Moon's spawn coming out of the sea and like crashing into the city and overwhelming it with the Dark Warren so that it becomes permanently part of the curled Lane or whatever it's called, Warren, the Warren of the Teist Andy, and it becomes Black Coral. That's like, I would love to see that in a movie. I think that my visualization in my mind probably isn't um, doesn't quite do it justice. Like I'd like to see how like a movie person could could imagine what that looks like. Um, I also think there's sort of this sacrifice of Moon Spawn that happens, and I'm not really sure. I'm hoping that there's a motive that gets understood in the future. And usually, when I say something like this, there is a motive, and it's a read and find out moment. So I'm expecting to read and find out. But something that is in my mind that I'm thinking about is Animander Rake sort of hid away for most of the book. I guess it was actually shortly after the scene with Whiskey Jack that I talked about earlier, I believe. Animander disappeared. Corlat didn't even know where he was. He sort of took Moon Spawn on this secret mission, buried it under the water in this trench, and it came out during the battle and crashed into the city, and it sort of ruined Moon Spawn. So it was kind of this Hail Mary, I think, that Animander prepared, and he sort of signed up the Tystandy's home to destruction. He ultimately, I think what happened was that like the Warren was unleashed in such a way that it sort of permanently infected the world. So now Black Coral is sort of has become the home of the Tystandy instead of Moonspawn. At least that's what I'm understanding of it. But Moonspawn itself was sort of ruined and has to be sent away. So I feel like that's not a sacrifice that comes lightly, because Moonspawn was this like movable fortress, and now there's like a singular non-movable fortress that the Tystandy have, which kind of sucks in comparison. Um, but I do think it was very wholesome that Moonspawn became the gravesite to Whiskey Jack and the Bridge Burners, which really symbolizes the bond that was formed between Animander and Whiskey Jack. and also the Whiskey Jack and Corlat relationship over the course of the book. I think the, you know, mutual respect that got earned over the course of the book, it was, perfectly symbolized in this moment. And now there's like this permanent relic of the bridge burners and the Tystandi relationship. And Moonspawn sort of just got sent out into the sea, and we, may or may not see that in the future again. But um, at the very least, Paran was able to like teleport there with Quick Ben, so perhaps they could teleport there again in the future, unless it goes underwater eventually. I don't know if it's just gonna float forever or not. Um, and then the other thing that sort of happened during the siege is that the Mib or the Mib, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that either. I said Mib the entire time, and I think it's Mib, but the Mib got a happy ending after suffering the entire book as well. We sort of learned that Silver Fox had planned this dream world for her to live in forever because Silver Fox took her life away by being born and like took stole her youth. She became an old woman immediately. And in this dream world, there's also there was like the beast thrones for Tog and Fandaray, and then also like the Talani Moss. The memories of the Talani Moss sort of got unlocked and rained down as hail in this dream world. So I think this was a really um, it was a really interesting ending. I wasn't sure what was going to happen with the Mib or the Mib. She she was suffering for most of the book, and I guess I'm like glad that she got a way to sort of get her life back, but also I think uh, I'm struggling to come up with a word here, but the imagery, I guess, of the memories of ice, which is the title of the book, of course, comes up a lot of times throughout this book, talking about the Jagged and the Talani Moss struggle. But I think it was even more, it was very punctuated in this moment where the frozen memories from the first gathering of the Talani Moss sort of got unlocked and were raining down on this new dream world. So I don't know if this dream world is going to become something that we go back to ever again or not. But I do think that like um, this is one of the times where the title of the book played um, such a large role in what happened within the book. Obviously, like in Deadhouse Gates, they arrive at the Deadhouse Gates at some point, so like it's there for a reason. It makes sense. Gardens of the Moon, I'm assuming, is referencing Moonspawn, but um, either way, this title, Memories of Ice, like it comes up a lot. The characters mention like Memories of Ice or Times of Ice a lot. So I do think that this was like a really nice ending, or one of many actually nice endings that had to had to deal with these like memories from the past from 300,000 years ago. Finally being unlocked or having some satisfying ending, sort of a conclusion to the Talani Moss Jagged struggle in some way. Um, all right, so the next point that I have is talking a little bit more about Paran. I think there's probably a lot that I could talk about here, but also at this point, my memory of exactly what happened with him um, is slowly fading. So mostly, what I wanted to focus on is how Paran is now the master of the deck. Um, so ultimately, he did get sort of this magical superpower, which is something that wasn't too surprising to me because he was such a main character in Gardens of the Moon and wasn't really he had Opan's luck, but he was like being influenced by God in that way. But he was also just kind of a normal dude. So I did expect him to become more than a normal dude at some point, and that it finally happened here. Um, we learn at some point that Shren, who was I forget what his name was in this book, he was pretending to be like the banner man for Dujek One Arm. I think that was extremely transparent. I think through context clues that got given away very early in the book that Taishren was mysteriously gone and this other guy randomly showed up. So I think, at the last scene with Whiskey Jack, we knew who Taishren was all along. Um, but anyways, Taishren was preparing what's her name? Whoever was with Tattersail. He was preparing Tattersail to be mistress of the deck. And that obviously didn't happen because Tattersail died, and sort of became Silver Fox and is part of Silver Fox now. But instead, Paran became master of the deck. So I'm wondering if I don't know how much influence Teicheren had on being able to make Tattersail the mistress of the deck, but I do think that was set up in Gardens of the Moon because she kept doing these readings. Um, and because Paran and Tattersail had this limited connection, it does make some sense that it was kind of transferred onto him eventually. And also, the Bridge Burners have a lot of um, there's a lot of references within the Bridge Burners of playing cards and doing things with this deck. So this all kind of adds up. But he gets the burden in this book of either blessing or denying the House of Chains. So this is like the main moment that I want to focus on with his Master of the Deck ability. There's a scene where I think it was in Capistan shortly after the other scene with Fenner, where Gruntle and Paran are talking about the implication of the House of Chains becoming part of the deck, becoming a house becoming a house of the deck of dragons, and ultimately they agree that so Paran is being told by other gods, he's being influenced to keep the House of Chains out of the deck and not allow the House of Chains to become a House of Chains and just chains, I guess. And him and Gruntle are talking about it, and they actually think that they agree that if Chains is added to the house and it becomes the House of Chains, then all of a sudden the House of Chains has to play by the same rules that all the other houses have to play by. And it's not clear what those rules are, but it is clear that Pran and Gruntle both agree that being unbounded by whatever the deck bounds these magical groups by is perhaps more dangerous than allowing them in. So I don't think that there actually is a like formal blessing of the House of Chains in this book, but it's clear that Pran is kind of ignoring the advice of the other gods who are trying to influence him, or gods or ascendants. I'm not sure which, maybe both, but the gods and ascendants are trying to influence Paran towards disallowing the House of Chains to become a house of the deck, and Paran it seems like is going to allow it. And hopefully that pays off. Hopefully, whatever rules exist around this deck are enough to like limit its power, and that comes into. But I think that that was the most interesting part about the like house or the master of the deck so far, besides the cool ability that Paran has now to like teleport around. And also at the very end, he decides to move into the Azoth house that showed up in Darujistan. So that's interesting as well. He just sort of like walked in and was like, "I'm going to live here now." I think so. I guess he has that ability now. Um, all right. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the Malazan Empire as a whole. I wrote down thoughts on the Malazan Empire and good versus evil. So this is just something that I was thinking about, which is we kind of in this book we there is suddenly established a bad guy or like an existential threat that it seems like the world needs to team up on to tackle, and that is the crippled god and this House of Chains. And so that caused me to think about the Malazan Empire and Animander Rake and all these other people and how they fit into this like good versus evil battle. I think during my Gardens of the Moon read through, my initial interpretation of Animander Rake and Kaladin Brood was that they were the bad guys because we were reading from the Malazan perspective, and in the Siege of Pale, Animander was defending them. We later in the book learn that Animander's not necessarily he's not a bad guy. They were just on opposite sides of a war, and he is much more morally gray. And the Malazan Empire is also morally gray. There is a conversation that happens in this book, and I don't even remember who is having the conversation, but I think it was Kaladin Brood and maybe Kalor were talking about it. But they were saying that the Malazan Empire comes through and conquers these cities, which is kind of a bad thing, but also ultimately the lives of the everyday people who live in these cities generally improves after the Malazans take over. So, there's an asterisk to this, which they don't talk about, which is that I believe that they've been like purging the nobles. I think they did that after Pale, and there's a purge of the nobles in Quantali and stuff in the past. So not everybody is better off, but it seems like the general feeling was that the average person's life improves when the Malazan Empire takes over, even though there is maybe some war and death to lead up to that. Um, which I think is just very interesting because the Malazan Empire is, maybe by default, people would think of them as a good guy because it's the perspective that we're reading a lot of these things from. Um, but they do, they're imperialists and they're like expansionists. And so that's not necessarily things that the good guys do. But at the same time, they are generally improving the lives of the people whose cities they're conquering, and it seems like they're also okay with keeping the culture of the people that they conquer around as well. Like they're not imposing their culture, or at least that's my thoughts. Because there's the Wiccans from Deadhouse Gates, which were a tribe on Quantali, I believe, and the Malazans conquer them, but like they're still allowed to be Wiccans and do their thing the way their tribe does. They're just like, part of the Malazan Empire now. So it seems to me like people get to keep their culture and maybe their way of life. Maybe there's some war in the interim, but the Malazans take over and sort of improve things through their, imperial structure or whatever. So I don't that's not really a concrete point that I'm making here, but there's a lot that I'm thinking about in terms of like, is the Malazan Empire a good or evil force? And it seems like it's actually kind of in between. It's like as morally gray as maybe what like Animander Rake is doing, where he has this like sword that traps souls forever, but also he's not like a bad guy. He's trying to generally do good for the world. And same thing with Kaladin Brood, like they're warring with the Malazan Empire, but also he has to wield this hammer of burn which can like destroy the world. And he is not done he's not doing that because he wants to like save the world instead. So there's some stuff that's pretty interesting there. um I'm also curious how the I wrote down the morally gray war in seven cities, in the seven cities goes through. So um the other thing that's happening that obviously this book doesn't touch on, but is probably going to be um, going to come up in future books is what's going on with the whirlwind and Shaik and Haran's sister, who's the new adjunct, Tavor, because there's a battle that's going to happen on the Seven Cities again between Tavor and this whirlwind goddess. Um, it's also not clear there who the good guys are and who's the bad guys, unless the whirlwind goddess, I guess Shaik, aligns herself with the crippled god, because then it's like, oh, okay, well, they're definitely evil now. Like that's definitely a bad thing. But so far we don't really know that. So it's kind of like this battle where we don't know which side, or I don't know which side to actually root for, because neither of them at the moment at least um, are currently evil. So I'm interested to see where that goes. I assume that the House of Chains is going to acquire some new team members. They did, we know that Calor is I don't remember if he was like the knight or something, but he was offered a position in the House of Chains. There was like that Jagged who became the messenger for the House of Chains as well. So they're recruiting. So I'm curious to see what happens over in the Seven Cities, um, and how that war goes, and like where the lines of good versus evil get established or don't get established on purpose. Because I think very clearly there's a um, not a hesitancy, but just like it doesn't make sense to clearly define the lines of good and evil, because it's just we're just kind of reading things as they are. Erickson is in a way writing a fake history book, and it's just up to us to like parse out who is actually right and who is actually wrong, and make our own interpretations, and not just like do the interpreting for us. So that's like it's something that I like about the Malazan series. It's really just like snippets of history that are written from certain perspectives, and it's kind of on the reader to figure out what to think of that history, and like which parts to agree with, or like to align with. So looks like I've been talking for another 40 minutes now, so I'm going to wrap up this video here. I don't have any more notes anyways. There's still probably 100 topics from this book that I did not talk about, so apologies to that. There's probably not enough for a part 3, so I don't think that I'll end up doing another part. But that's all for this one. If you watch this entire video, then you should probably click the subscribe button. I have a lot more rambling to do in the future on the Malazan books and other books that I'm reviewing. So thank you so much for watching.